Hi, on Monday, February 8th, the Segal Centre, in collaboration with Temple Emanu-El, presented a panel discussion on the short documentary film, Becoming Nakuset. Over 250 people showed up for this conversation, and if you're watching this right now, so are you. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. As part of the event, we watched this 12-minute documentary together, and then what followed was a discussion. As we received special permission from the CBC to do this, the film will actually not be part of what you are about to watch. So before you get started, we encourage you to go to CBC Gem, where you can watch this short film and then continue on with this event. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being a part of the conversation.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Rabbi Lisa Grushcow. I have the honor of moderating this evening's discussion and the film that we will be watching. I want to begin with the following land acknowledgement. The Segal Centre is situated on the traditional territory of the Ganyen-Gehaka people. The land was also a diplomatic meeting place with other Iroquoians and Algonquins, including Algonquin Anishinaabe, Atikamekw, and Huron-Wendat. We acknowledge that we're located on a land that has been the site of human creativity and storytelling for thousands of years, and are thankful that we are able to create, collaborate, play, and work here. And to my understanding, this evening is part of shared creativity and collaboration that's been going on with the Segal Centre for a number of years now, together and partnered with Nakuset, and we'll hear more about that as we go forward. But where we're going to begin tonight is with the CBC short doc, a 12-minute film, which is incredibly powerful, tremendous amount that comes in those 12 minutes. And that'll be followed by a panel discussion. And so what I'd like to do before we see the film is introduce the panelists who will be with us this evening. Then we'll watch the film. Then there'll be around a half hour for a panel discussion and some time for questions and answers before we're done this evening. And so let me begin by introducing each of our panelists. And as I do so, I believe that they will appear so that you can see them as well. And as I said, then we'll watch the film, we'll have some discussion with the panel and Q&A after. So I'll begin by introducing our first panelist, who also is the subject of the documentary, Nakuset, who is the executive director of the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal, Cree from La Ronge, Saskatchewan. She has three beautiful boys, Kisten, Makisis, and Mahikin. She was adopted by a Jewish family in Montreal and draws on her adoptee experience in her advocacy work for Indigenous children in care. She created, produced, and hosted the television series Indigenous Power, was voted Woman of the Year 2014 by the Montreal Council of Women, and she is the Indigenous columnist for MATV's City Life. Nakuset was featured in Real Talk on Race, the award-winning CBC series. In 2017, she was selected by the CKX City series, and I think this is a pretty exceptional title to be selected for, as a speaker/shift disturber due to the work that she does to shift the status quo for urban Aboriginal women. In November 2017, she was a speaker for TEDx Montreal Women. In 2018, she testified for 3 days at the Vienne Commission, a public inquiry into the discrimination against Indigenous people of Quebec. She testified in June 2018 at the MMIW Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry in Calgary, and in February 2019, she presented at We Day. She was recently featured in the end of 2010's Interview for Global to discuss the past decade of work with the urban Indigenous community. She's honored to spearhead and run the Cabot Square project since its inception and to co-found Resilience Montreal. And many of you may have seen and heard her in recent days speaking about the heating tent, the heating station in Cabot Square, which was an extraordinary project of cooperation and so vitally important. And she is dedicated to improving the lives of urban Indigenous people. And so we will hear more from her tonight. The next panelist I have to introduce in Nakuset, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you and to be collaborating in this way. I want to introduce as our next panelist, Victoria Anderson-Gardner, who is an award-winning Ojibwe filmmaker from Eagle Lake First Nation, Ontario, and the maker of tonight's film. They completed their thesis film for a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree under the School of Image Arts at Ryerson University. Victoria is focused on creating Indigenous content, showcasing underrepresented communities, and using their skills as a filmmaker to educate. With over 4 years of experience in the film industry, Victoria is a director and producer who has worked and assisted on a variety of productions, which include Tanaya, Becoming Nakuset, The Hurt That Binds Us, and many others. And it's extraordinary for someone who's been in the industry for 4 years to have not only so many films, it seems to me, but also so many awards, including the Toronto International Film Festival's Big Pitch Audience Choice Award, CBC Gem, Best Short Film, and so on. Victoria currently sits as an advisory board member for Art with Impact, where they sit on the jury for their monthly film competitions, is a brand ambassador for the Indigenous-led charity called Inspire, and is the Indigenous Achievement Tutor at Superior Collegiate and Vocational Institute in Thunder Bay. Then I have the honor of introducing our final panelist, Daniel Milner. Daniel Milner was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba in 1973. He was adopted after his first year on this earth to a blonde, blue-eyed family who already had a child. They did not keep Daniel, and he was returned to care. Not long after, he was then adopted by a family living in Montreal and grew up there. And then in Daniel's words, continuing the bio, he writes, "I was adopted by a Jewish man and his Irish-Scottish wife. They had a son who was 2 years older. I remained with this family until I ran away at 17. At 28, I found my bio sister out of the blue. At 30, I moved to Manitoba to seek out my bio family and was fortunate enough to meet my bio mother and siblings. There are 7 siblings, of which the first 3 were adopted. I found my sister born right after me, living not too far from where I was living. We still talk to this day." And I think that even just the introduction of these panelists gives a sense of how many stories are in this space that we share tonight. And how important it is to hear them told. And so without any further ado, I want to ask us to turn to the film for you to give it your attention for these next 12 minutes and then to our panelists after. I want to take a moment before we leap right into the discussion, just to let those 12 minutes sit with us for a moment. I'm going to ask the panelists to turn their videos on so that we can all see each other. And I want to begin by asking you, and perhaps Nakuset, you can reply first, and then Victoria, and then Daniel, seeing this film tonight, what do you hope will come from it? A nice small question to start us off.
How about you ask Victoria that question first?
All right, Victoria first.
Oh, yeah, that's the big question first. Like, to get my thoughts together a little bit after watching it, even though I've seen it like a lot of times, I don't know, it still hits every time in a different way. I think something, like a huge thing that I'm hoping for from this is that what we're doing now is that it's like creating dialogue in regards to the 60s scoop and what happened to countless people and how it's affected people to this day, because I feel like it's a part of history that's not really talked about as often. And could I
ask you, given that there may be people here perhaps who are hearing that for the first time, to say a little bit more about the 60s scoop as the context for this film?
So for people who are unaware of this part of history in Canada, is there was a period in time, as you can guess, during the 60s and like many years after that, where people were taken from their home communities. Indigenous people were taken from their home communities, and they were brought through like this one adoption program called, as you saw in the film, Adopt an Indian Métis program. And they were taken from their homes, usually not by consent necessarily, and they were adopted into like other families, and a lot of them were disconnected from their culture and their families, and a lot of them have gone through like hardships of just like really horrible stories. But I don't know if you want to say some more. Nakuset.
Wait. I want to hear from Dan now, because he used to work for Indian Affairs and used to have the big sort of all the listings of all the 60 Scoop kids. You want to jump in, Dan?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for hosting me. On the other side of this story is it's a vast story that should be told, just like any other story that we know about here in Canada. It's very important, I think, to get the story out, because it's I don't think we're the only ones here, right? There's other people who've been adopted who are good in their skin. Other people are just horribly in a bad situation, in a bad spot still today. And there's a lot of people I know who are still struggling with this. And here we are close to, our 50s. So at this point, I think it's time for this story to come out, so the public can put this in the history, put this in the history books, so we know where everything went wrong and how they can not go back to this, not go back to taking these kids away. Because I've heard a lot of bad stories, and coming from different parts of the country, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, even Ontario. I've met a lot of adoptees just by accident, and I've sat down with them and talked to them, and they say the same thing. I want to tell my story, but where can I tell my story? And a lot of them don't have this access to different resources like we have now, right? And a lot of people back in the day, such as my mother, she didn't have any resources back in the day to help her raise me. And so there's been a lot of change between those days and today. But at the same time, I don't think the government has done much change in terms of how they treat us.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in now since I let Dan and Victoria go. So yeah, 60 Scoop was a government policy, and the policy was to assimilate Indigenous people as quickly as possible. That's why they had the AIM program, and easily 20,000 people were put through the AIM program, but chances are the number is a lot higher than that. And basically, it is a status issue, and it's a land issue, right? So I'm from Treaty 6, and when I was adopted, I lost my treaty, sort of entitlement to the land. So, the government definitely had an idea why they were doing that. I think that even though the 60 Scoop is officially over, it's not over because Indigenous children are overrepresented in the youth protection system. And they say if you look at all the kids that went to residential school, it's like times 200 of all the children that are currently in youth protection. So it hasn't changed. It's gotten worse. I don't know if this movie can make a difference. That would be cool. But I think that, community efforts need to sort of step up and demand why. Every day I'm reading that, Manitoba is still apprehending babies from the hospital. Why are they still doing that? It continues. And unless someone actually says you need to do better, they're not going to do better. So now I'll just pass it over to Rabbi Lisa.
You may have put me on the spot as much as I put you on the spot before. So we did start with a heavy question, but of course it's a heavy topic, and I'm glad you mentioned residential schools, because I think that that's something that non-Indigenous people are also slowly becoming aware of, and the 60 Scoop is seeing that in the same context in terms of taking people off their land and assimilation and loss of culture and so on. Dan, I wonder if I could turn to you, if you're comfortable with it, to share a little of what your story is and how seeing Nakusets represented in this way perhaps makes you think about your own?
Yeah, well, I was adopted back in 1975. There was a first family that adopted me. I was probably about 1.5, and they lived in Winnipeg. Apparently, he was a teacher, and so was she, and they were in the midst of a divorce, so they couldn't take care of me anymore, so they brought me back. And my first memory is of being in a room with a bunch of other Native kids, and we were all in those big steel cribs that looked like jail bars. And I remember being there with all these other kids, and I didn't want to be there. So I figured out a way of getting out. So I escaped a couple of times, trying to obviously find my mother. And at this point, I'm probably like almost 2 years old. I can walk around, I can jump. I remember that. So I tried to escape, and I remember the nurses picking me up and saying, "What are you doing out of your crib?" And so they put me back in there. And obviously those cribs had springs on them. So I was using the springs to jump myself out of the crib. So I got out and I fell on the floor, and I went down the hall again, and they caught me again. And so this happened a couple of times, and then finally they smartened up and they removed the springs and put a wood plaque on the bottom of the bed, so I couldn't jump anymore. But I figured out a way of getting underneath the bed and around the plaque, and I escaped again. So this happened a couple of times, and I don't know why I remember this, but it happened. So now afterwards, I was adopted by the family in Montreal. And basically the story goes where my adopted mother tells me she came to pick me up. I was at the family's home, the first family's home, in my room with my toys. And my adopted mother came and picked me up there, took my toys, and just basically put me on the plane with her, and we flew back to Montreal. And that's where I began my life with the Scottish Irish and the Jewish father. And from there, my earliest memories too are of my brother and I, who was 2 years older than I am. We basically we got along great. And then from there, they divorced as well because of some physical issues going on in the house. And I went to live with my father. And at that point, it got, things weren't very easy at all. There was a lot of abuse. He was an angry man. He used to beat his former wife in front of us, my brother and I. So there's quite a crazy times, I would say, which I had no control of. And so here we are years later, and I'm still struggling with it because on a daily basis I'm reminded by my adoptive father how things are. So at the same time, it's a never-ending story with this, and so I'm glad to be able to tell my story at the same time to get it out. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Victoria, I wonder for you, coming from a younger generation, what it's like to hear these stories and be part of telling them.
I just want to say miigwech, Daniel, for sharing your story. Honestly, ever since like the release of the film, there's been lots of people coming forward telling me a lot of like their own stories, a lot of like 60 Scoop stories. I've gotten like many emails and messages, and I'm always grateful for anyone who's willing to share anything about something so personal. And it just makes me realize how much that we haven't talked to each other, like just as Indigenous people. Like I found like from a young age, I never really talked to my parents or my family about like the traumas. And it's only been, I think, in the past maybe like 5 to like 6 years that I've actually started asking questions about it. And I find like a lot of other people, like a lot of other like Indigenous friends of mine have also been trying to like talk to their parents about it, trying to understand more. just because I think we're realizing that it's like, it's time to break these cycles. And like, I know talking to like my own mom and my dad about their own things that they've gone through growing up, like, because my mom was also part of the 60s scoop, and just actually wondering about her own story. It's heartbreaking. Like, it's really hard to hear, but it also helps me to understand them better. And like, I think that's one of the things that I hope from this, is that everyone talks to each other to try to understand each other better, because we all have such fragile hearts. And I think just like having that understanding with each other really helps us to not feel so alone or confused about like our own identities. And I think that's a huge part of all of this, is just understanding each other. Obviously there's a lot more behind the fact, but when it comes down to just like the more human core aspect of it, that's where I'm coming from with it.
I think that's so beautifully said, and it makes me think, Nakuset, of the name of your organization, of resilience, right? And that it's not about ignoring vulnerability; it's about the resilience that comes through that and on the other side. But I want to raise a question which I'm seeing a few people raising in different ways in the Q&A, that we'll go to that more formally later. But I think it's a bit of an elephant in the room, given that we're doing this under the auspices of the Segal Centre and of Temple Emanu-El. I don't think that this is generally part of Jewish self-perception in terms of a Jewish story in Montreal. Having taken part in something like the 60s scoop, being a painful part of others' stories. And Nakuset, what I really appreciate about how you tell your story and how it's told in this documentary is that, you know, it's not black and white. There's your Bubbe and the tremendous love that the two of you had for one another. And then there's the relationship with your adoptive parents and the family in which you were raised. But it raises questions, obviously, for the Jewish community as a whole, I think. And I know that's an area where you've done work with Temple, with Segal Centre, with others, and that it's part of your own identity as well. So I wonder if you could help us think about that together tonight also. And maybe you can start us off. I apologize for putting you on the spot again, but Daniel, maybe it's something you can weigh in on as well. And Victoria, perhaps in terms of the context of the 60s scoop, I see there are questions coming up. If anyone knows the involvement of Jewish families, I know that Jewish culture has often encouraged adoption. We usually think of that as a good thing. But in this case, clearly it's more complicated.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure what your question was, because you just gave a big intro and I don't know if there was really a direct question, but let me just I think I know what you're trying to say, all right? So if you look at all of Canada and how they participated for the 60s scoop with the AIM program and all that, Montreal is the only province within Canada where the Jewish Family Services got involved in the 60s scoop. It's a real rarity. And I think that the issue was that the government was just trying to get rid of these children. They literally, when my parents went to Jewish Family Services and they got my brother Neil, there were white children. They got to choose. When they went back a couple of months later for another kid, all the white kids were gone. They're like, we're only giving out Indians now. Choose an Indian. They're all from all over Canada. And the whole idea of choosing Native children that were far away, you know, like, you know, I was born in Thompson, Manitoba, in Winnipeg. So was Dan. How did we end up from Winnipeg all the way here? Well, it's really hard to sort of go back to your roots. So that was another thing. But when the children were adopted into Jewish Family Services, there were no social workers to say, this is how you raise an Indigenous child. It was the opposite. It was like, forget they're Native. Don't tell them they're Native. Just, you know, put them in the mikvah and, you know, they grow up. You know, I'm pretty sure Dan had a bar mitzvah, right? Like this, just put them, you did it? No. Okay. Well, I didn't have a bar mitzvah either.
Well, my mom said, my adoptive mother said, when she picked me up from the house in Winnipeg, the social worker gave her my birth certificate, which had her name and my Jewish father's name on it. So right away from the get-go, it's as if they were saying, he's no longer First Nation. Let's forget about it. Just move on. Here we are. Here's your child.
Yep. and that's why it's so hard to get your Indian status back. Because when I was 20, like 18 or 19, I went to the Native Friendship Center, and you have to fill out these forms to get your Indian status. And it says, well, who's your mother? And I'm like, I don't know. Who's your father? I don't know. Where are you from? I don't know. What are you? Cree? Oh, we'll start working on it right away. And
the thing was, though, when I applied for my status card, I put my adoptive parents' names on there, and it went through. So it's as if they already knew the information at Indian Affairs who my parents were.
That's interesting, because it took me like 5 years, and it was only when my Bubbe sent me back to meet my real family that I was able to find the band. And then through my biological mother, she just claimed that, yes, this is my child, and that's how we did it. But that's super interesting. Wow. I don't know if that answered your question there, Lisa. Oh, I just want to do a shout out. My cousin Jojo and my Aunt Donna are here in the crowd somewhere. So hello, family, adopted family.
So I wonder, was that approach to adoption any different within the Jewish community from the general community with regard to Native children versus other children, or was that how adoption was seen in the 60s overall, that there wasn't that kind of education or support for how to raise a child with connection to where they were coming from?
I mean, when I was adopted, it was clearly obvious that I wasn't part of the family, but I have a whole rich culture that I was taken away from. And through, like the Indian Act and residential school and losing our culture and our language and our names and our land, it's just a continuation of that. So I think they just didn't understand that if you bring up a child without giving them cultural pride, that people just, it took a long time for me to get that cultural pride. And I always make that joke. It's not even a joke. I saw Dances with Wolves, and I was really a born again Indian. I was like, oh my God, that's what our people are like. I want to become one. And I actually almost ran out and got chokers, because I do have a whole bunch of them. Anyway, I'll let Dan go, or Victoria.
Well, let me actually jump in and ask you then, if that was clearly it was such a normative view, right? That assimilationist point of view. What do you think let your Bubbe see things differently?
Well, I think the reason why my Bubbe saw things differently, she was just a really good human being. Like she just kind of loved the underdog. Like she saw those that were sort of thriving and those that were sort of, struggling. And she was that kind of person to always help, right? But also my Bubbe was, she had to convert into the family. She was not Jewish, so she was a convert. And then I had my aunt, who was also a convert, and then me. So they called us all converts, and we were super close. All of us were like huddled together going, oh my God, why are you getting treated this way? So we found that in each other, right? And we became very close. And, we, at least, with my aunt, I still talk to her. Unfortunately, my Bubbe passed away, during the ice storm there. But yeah, so I think that had to do with it also. It's not easy, being adopted into the Jewish culture and being Indigenous and being a woman, like it's almost like 3 strikes, you're out. But, I'm still very proud of being Jewish, even though I'm not like a practicing Jew, but, I still have a lot of love for the culture and a lot of respect. And it's half of who I am. When I meet other Native people, they're like, you're not really that Native. You're more Jewish. Like your accent is Jewish, and, you can't hunt, and good luck with that. And you're not going to dress like that on the reservation, are you? Sorry.
Well,
Daniel, you gave such a sigh there. That was such an that you said, I have to ask you what was behind it.
Well, she had a Bubbe and I had a nanny, and she was the softest lady I ever knew. She was like the sponge to my life. And she was she did everything that a granny should, and she did it. But at the same time, she lived through the Second World War. She fled the Nazis, and her husband found her, and apparently, the story goes where, she was serving the Nazis, and my grandfather was a plumber, so he was doing things for the Nazis. And my father, my adoptive father, he was actually born in Frankfurt, Germany, right after the war, 1946. So that goes to say that my nanny had a lot of character, and she'd gone through a lot. And so she has some passion, she lived through this terrible time. So when I was growing up, knowing her, she was very helpful and very caring, and took the time to talk to me, and showed me how to act, how to dress. She basically showed me everything. And she passed away several years ago, and it was hard to see her deteriorate. And at the same time, I didn't feel close anymore to her as you would expect to be. But over the years, when I ran away at 17, I ran away for a reason, and it was hard to face her afterwards, knowing what I knew, where I came from as a First Nation. Because before I ran away, I was convinced I was one of them, and going to school, doing the things that everybody does at that age, working, going to school, having a life, going to these suppers, Hanukkah and all this, celebrating all the Jewish traditions and all that, which was great. But at the same time, there was a darker side to, her kids. And obviously my adoptive father, it was, obviously he was treated very badly, because, when you abuse somebody, obviously it comes from somewhere. Either you're abusing yourself or you're just messed up. And so somewhere down the line, things got crazy.
I'm seeing a lot of questions about this whole issue of Jews adopting Indigenous kids as part of the 60 Scoop. And Victoria, I wonder whether in your work in creating the film, you came across more on this that you can share with people tonight. I'm reading remarks from people who were adoptive parents and did so with, all the best intentions and fullness of heart. And I'm seeing it, and Nakuset, we said this when we spoke about the film before, there's, at least a couple different levels, right? One is this systemic thing that was so terrible that happened with the 60 Scoop, and the lack of support, the lack of understanding for what it might mean to raise a child connected to their culture. And then on top of that, there's both of you, it sounds like, landed in families where there were such troubled and toxic and abusive and painful dynamics, right? And so, but I think also of the families who adopted with good intent without those dynamics. And someone, I think, said in the comments that what they had heard was that Jewish families were the ones that were open to adopting Indigenous kids in Montreal. And so I don't know. I'm curious if any of you can weigh in again on that question of that relationship between Jewish adoptive parents, Indigenous kids raised within Judaism. Why here in Quebec and not elsewhere in Canada? What more light can any of you shed on that piece? Because I'm hearing a lot of curiosity about it.
From what I know, from the stories told by my adopted mother, she actually went through a Jewish adoption agency in Montreal. And she was given, she had several books, and one of the books was of First Nation kids. And they basically went through it and said, okay, we'll try this kid, we'll try this kid. But it didn't work out for them. And so they found me through the agency in Winnipeg. And that's where they found me, and basically flew out and got me and brought me back to Montreal. So I don't know the reasons behind the Jewish, adoption agency was seeking out First Nation kids. Like, I don't know that. Maybe there were other kids involved too. As Nakuset said, maybe there was other, non-Indigenous white kids that were being adopted first, and probably they ran out of those kids, and the next thing available was First Nation. So, I don't know.
I don't know if you had something to first. Wow, if you had something to say first, Nakuset. I would say though, like, just because we do have access to the internet, is Google it, like try to do your own research on it, just because, well, this film is like part of like getting the information out there, but it's also to like almost like kickstart that own research for yourself out there, to actually look into it and see if you can find like your own resources. Just because that's what I did for the film, was like I looked up things, but there's lots of things out there. But I think Dan kind of covered like the things that I found, and then just like the own stories that I've heard from other people. The only like other thing that I heard just from when I was asking some people from my own reserve who were part of the 60 Scoop about it, was that it was the books that they remembered the most, is that they just remember seeing the catalogs. And that's like the biggest thing that I've heard about too.
And it's funny because my sister, who was adopted just after me, she was born 9 months after me. She was adopted. She has a completely different story. Her family was white, and they adopted her through an agency again, but it didn't work out for her either. And she left when she was 14. And she basically went to the community in Nakuset, and she's been there ever since. So they basically took her in. The community adopted her, right? And so I think if she had never gone there, I think she would have been even in a rougher place, you know? So I think that saved her. In a sense, that saved her, because she felt belonged, and she still lives there. So she feels that she belongs.
So back in the day, Dan and I were, like, we know each other a long time. We used to be with this group called ANA, Advocacy for Native Adoptees, when like we were in our 20s. And we saw there were a lot of, Native adoptees in Montreal. And there were other Native adoptees that are adopted by like other adoption agencies. It was just the policy. I think the government went to these agencies and said, hey, guess what? We have a new policy. It's called AIM. You want to join it? Here's a book. I think that's how Jewish Family Services got involved, right? Like, it wasn't like they didn't know any different, and, I don't think anyone adopted, Native kids with bad intentions, right? They were like, oh, look how cute this kid is, I'll give her a Hebrew name, Miriam, and we'll give her the best things in life. I think they had good intentions. It's just when you take someone from one culture and immerse them into something completely different that denies who they are, that's where the harm starts. And that's why, like, throughout the years, I've met other people where they adopt a Chinese child and they're like bringing them back to China. They're learning about the culture. They're not ignoring. For whatever reason, during this period of time, it was ignore the culture, give them something better. And we saw, like Dan and I saw, this group that, what's created, a lot of us were really suffering. However, we also know other Jewish Indians, which is what I call them, that, had really supportive families. That was just not, I had a really supportive Bubbe and aunts and uncles and cousins and everyone, just not so much my parents. So I have, that's why I've got family here today watching. Hope I'm doing a good job, guys.
I think, like, adding on to that, just from like my own, like from my mom's story, because my mom wasn't taken for like her entire life like other people were. She was taken just for like a period of her life. And I know she said that she's actually met who was like her like adopted mother at the time. Like, she's met her now as like an adult. And I know that I think like I guess like talking about like other stories is that if she hadn't have gone for those years, that her life might have not been as good as it is. So like there's so many different stories. That's the thing, is like it's just like hearing them though and like listening to the stories. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah. Sorry, I had to. I just wanted to say, like when I was in, foster care before. So I was put into foster care for many times before I was actually adopted for, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 different foster homes. But I was with my sister Sonia. And, we were separated. And then when we eventually found each other through my Bubbe, she had a life similar to mine in terms of our careers, that she, although she had like very difficult times growing up in foster care and growing up in group homes and bouncing between my biological mother and different people and being on the streets for a while. When I finally met her, she was someone who worked in Kenora, that had like, you know, a really strong work ethic, that, you know, was doing really well. So when you talk about like, we had such similarities, even though we had different lifestyles, but we were still sort of, you know, on the same path and very ambitious. So when you talk about nature versus nurture, I'm not exactly sure if it's just our DNA that makes us really strong, that we're used as Indigenous people to like all these obstacles. Like really, I don't know how we get out of bed every day. There's so many things that are like against us, and yet we still do. So, but again, you know, my Bubbe's kindness, you know, was just the, it was that kernel of hope that she gave me. And she kept saying, you're going to do great. You're a good person. You're a good person. I was like, no, 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 no. But part of it came in. And, you know, with this generation, and Dan is the same way. Like, he has children. He gives them so much love. You know, we're doing better with this next generation. And, you know, it's our job to do that. And again, also to help those that are struggling, which is why I do the work that I do. That was very long.
It is a perfect segue, though. I would love for you to talk more about the work that you do. And I was so moved in the film when you talk about how, you know, coming from where you were coming from, you started your work in terms of questioning, you know, why so many kids are in youth protective services, and how can we be doing better by families. So tell us a little, if you would, about the work that you do now, about where you see the needs now. A lot of what I'm seeing in the Q&A is people saying, you know, clearly, you know, what happened in the 60s was not the way to go about things. How do we do better? And I know that part of that is educating ourselves, right? As Victoria, you suggested, by go to Google, though it's funny, as a rabbi, I'm always wary of Google. I'm like, go look stuff up, but let me point you to a couple good websites so you don't kind of fall into the black hole there. But how do we, tell us about what you're doing now, and especially how it's playing out in terms of COVID, in terms of how this city is doing right now. And also for those of us who aren't on the front lines in the same way, where do we start?
Sorry, I don't know. Am I still muted? No, I'm not anymore. Okay, so what I'm doing everything, which is ridiculous. So, and I think that, you know, maybe Dan has this experience too, because it almost feels like because of being, you know, our experiences being adopted in the kind of work that we ended up doing, you know, I feel like a bit of an accomplishment junkie. I know that Dan also has a lot of sort of, you know, visions of how he can help the community, you know, of going back to his community and helping out, because he has the power and the knowledge and the, you know, the resources to do that. So I think that, you know, you get to a certain point in your life and your career where you turn around and you're like, why is this happening? And because I've been working at the Native Women's Shelter for over 20 years now, I have the capability to, you know, call the city of Montreal and say, listen, I already have the Cabinet Square project. So if I want to do, you know, the Raphael Andre warming tent, how do I make this happen? Oh, you need money? Michelle Odette, you know, Mary Goodleaf, everyone, we got all our money. What else do you need? So you constantly have to sort of push to address these issues, and it takes a long, well, I find it's taken a long time. I mean, I did the same thing with youth protection, where I went in and we created a cultural manual so that all the children that are being adopted into non-Indigenous families have sort of like an idiot's guide on how to raise an Indigenous child, right? Because my parents could have used that, but anyway, but you learn from your experiences, right? And then you put in what would have helped my parents, and then that is created, and now they're handed out a youth protection. And then you want to sort of, you know, if you're gonna adopt a Native child, these are some things you should know, kind of like video messages or something. I have lots and lots and lots of ideas, and you know, I work in so many different fields, because when the women come to the Native Women's Shelter and they are in crisis, how do you help them? So I can physically help them in the building, but they have to leave at some point. And if society is not going to change, then I need to help them find that way. So, I mean, during COVID, it's been ridiculous because, you know, the Native Women's Shelter was a little bit easier because, you know, women were staying at the shelter, but we had no guidelines on how to run a shelter COVID style. So we had to keep trying to learn from others and keep updating. But there was a time when, you know, from May the 14th until like June the 1st, we had to close the Native Women's Shelter down because 7 of our staff got sick. And we thought we had all the best policies and it still didn't work. Then Resilience Montreal, when COVID hit, every single organization in Montreal shut down. We were the only ones open. So we had all the people come to Resilience, and we were afraid that we were going to get shut down because we couldn't do the social distancing. So we literally crossed the street and took all our services into the park. And that was kind of frowned upon by the city of Montreal until they were like, wait a minute, parks for everyone. And they opened like 5 other parks that were doing more or less the same kind of services. But we were outside every single day from like the end of March all the way until the end of August. And now we're like, everyone, let's get back in the building. But it's hard because we can't give the services. We're like literally doing a Band-Aid. We're giving out amazing food. And I'd like to thank the temple for donating some of that food. And we're giving out clothing, and we still have our intervention workers, and we still try to get people to find, you know, housing, but we don't have that many staff, and people are becoming, you know, more in crisis every single day, and there are not enough services in Cabot Square. You know, when you see that Raphael Andre, you know, has nowhere to go during the curfew and goes to the bathroom to get some kind of, I don't know, you know, and he dies in the bathroom. That's really sad, right? How is that people are dying in the streets, in bathrooms, porta potties, or Indigenous people? So, you know, I was able to sort of, you know, with extending through some of my, you know, friends and partners to do something better. And we have this really great warming tent that the Innu community came down from Quebec, that, you know, Mohawk people are sending money and resources, staff, like we did it all. All we needed was permission from the city so that we could have the tent, which they gave us. And now we have to figure out, can we extend it for another, you know, period of time? Because we have it for 2 weeks, but it's still going to be cold after 2 weeks, and the people are ready to stay. But again, we need the permission. So, you know, at the beginning of the documentary, we talked about the second stage housing. That's actually happening now. So I think in the spring, we start building. So we're going to have 23 units for Indigenous women and children, and we're going to have the Dr. Julian Foundation social pediatrics in the building because we can't get anywhere with youth protection. So now we're going to make sure that we have professionals that surround the women and children and help them to make sure that the women and children stay together. So, and then there's, of course, Resilience Montreal, we need to move. So what else am I doing? I think that's it for now. Yeah, for now.
Yeah, just going back to the manual that you said you created for Indigenous children who are adopted by non-Indigenous parents. I think there should be a better screening process, because at best, you can identify somebody who has, you know, some kind of anger issues, but at the worst, you won't identify anything, and the child will be put in a home where there's abuse. My situation is such where my adoptive father abused me, and you can't change somebody like that because I trusted him with my children, and he continued abusing my children. So if you have a man who is not well at the beginning, he's never going to change at the end. So therefore, a person at the beginning should be vetted, I think, more than the GG of Canada should be, because here you're giving a child away, man, to a family who you don't know, right? And so behind doors, at the end of the day, you have no idea what's going on.
I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat about education. And I think about the fact that I've got, you know, one of my kids in a Jewish day school, and they do things for Black History Month, and they do things obviously around Jewish history, but there are very few voices to have the curriculum include residential schools, 60 Scoop, the stories of Indigenous peoples in this country. What, if anything, do the three of you see having changed in terms of education? Where would you love to see more change?
I would say at the reserve level, there should be some change going on there in terms of the education that the kids have. When I moved to Northern Manitoba in 2003, I went up there to get a job as a pilot. I graduated as a pilot and I found a job. But then after three to 6 months, the company went under. And so I moved to the reserve in Northern Manitoba, a town called South Indian Lake. And that's the end of the road there, literally. To get any further north, you need to go by plane. So here I am in the middle of nowhere, and I'm straight from Montreal, living in Northern Manitoba, and it's mind-boggling because these kids don't have not even 10% of what kids here in the city have. And when I say 10%, it's maybe the clothes and the food they have. Anything else, it's hard hit. I mean, they needed a math teacher. And I presented myself at the school and I said, well, I know math. And he says, well, are you willing to teach the grade 4s? And I said, sure. So here I am, a substitute teacher with no backing no education as a teacher, teaching these these grade 4s math. But in my classroom, I had kids who were 16 years old who had failed grade 4 math like year after year. I had other kids who were 10, and I had kids who were supposed to be in that classroom wanting to learn. And they couldn't learn because the 16-year-olds were impeding the younger ones from learning. So it goes to say that there's nothing going on in the reserves up north that help these kids. And these kids are just still today, you've got a kid grows up, he's 18 years old, he has a child, and now he's going to grow up the same way his parents grew up, by drinking and doing drugs and not caring about their kid going to school. I mean, it's happening today. It's still happening today. And it's just, there's no end to it. And these kids need the education. They need the teachers. And I met the principal that one year, and he had an inspiration. He was like, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But when it came down to actually spending the energy to do the things he wanted, it was a huge, enormous undertaking he was trying to do, and it is impossible for one person to do it. So I think a lot of what we need today is the youth. The youth need the support, the simple supports that they have here in the city.
I think like in regards to like other education as well, like just for like non-Indigenous students to know more about the histories, is making it mandatory to have like Indigenous history classes in like high schools, which I know they're actually starting to have more options, just because I know the high school that I work at right now as the Indigenous Achievement Tutor there's a lot more options for like Indigenous based classes, which is really cool to see. I don't know how it is though for like other places like in Canada. I just know that's how it is for like Northern Ontario schools. So I know right now they have like Indigenous, like expressing Aboriginal culture for art. They have like Indigenous English classes. So like you study just Indigenous authors and like the stories for that, which is really cool. But if they made that like mandatory across like all of Canada to have classes like that, and like make it that like students have to take those classes, I think that'd be really cool. I wish I had that when I was in high school, and I only graduated like 6 years ago.
Seriously, yeah.
Yeah.
My son, who's he's 11 right now, he's in grade 5. He's currently taking social sciences right now in class, and they're talking about Indigenous issues. And so a lot of the students, very young students, some of them have a good idea, other ones don't have any idea. But at the same time, I'm finding the teacher doesn't have any material to teach the kids. So my son is actually teaching the teacher a lot more than she knows. And so most of the things that he says, of course, come from me. But at the same time, I'm finding that the teachers have little resources. And at this point, I think when I was working for the government, I was working for learning and well-being department, and their mandate was to put classes up for the workers to sensitize them to Indigenous issues. Now, the materials that will be created by other Indigenous workers. That material then was used to teach the vast majority of employees at INAC. Now, that same sense, that's what should be done, I think, all throughout Canada is, there should be a group of First Nation people who are dedicating their time to create this material for the schools. Now, it's not to say that the schools will use that information, but I think it's a good base for the schools to use to start deciding what they should be teaching these kids.
So I'm going to just put in my 2 cents there. But I have the same experience as Dan does because my children also go to school and educate. But, here in Montreal, they don't celebrate, Aboriginal Day or Indigenous Peoples Day. It's June 21st. It's never even on any school's radar except for, maybe a couple, but I don't think anyone actually acknowledges it. Orange Shirt Day, Lisa, does your children, do they celebrate that at their school? Orange Shirt Day? See, so there's a thing where it's like, Indigenous people have, really sort of pushed forward to create like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and put forward 94 recommendations. And then they have 148 recommendations from the Viens Commission that no one actually implements. And then you have 294 calls to justice for missing and murdered, and no one's implementing that either. And then you have a government that's saying that there's no systemic racism here in Quebec. And it's really up to the government level to say, we believe that Indigenous, content needs to be in the school books, but they're not doing that. So it's a tough question. The solution is really for people to push different, school boards. I mean, I remember, for my kids, that the English Montreal School Board had something called an Aboriginal tutor. And this is something that my kids could have. I was like, yes, what nation? They're like, oh, they're white. We're white. I can't teach my kids about Aboriginal. Like, why is that? Why do, a lot of positions in Montreal that have the term Aboriginal have white people running them? Because there's still this sort of train of thought that, well, there's not enough of you, or you're not really qualified or whatever. So there needs to be a lot more change. But I would love to see people implement some of these, recommendations, because we get tired after a while of participating in them. It's like, well, you never actually did anything. The Viens Commission came out, last September, like over a year ago. And, youth protection has yet to apply any of them. And there's about 30 of them. So that's just one department. Anyway, we're almost out of time, eh?
We are. I have one final question to ask, and I also want to offer my apologies to everybody in the chat whose questions I was not able to bring forward. They have all been really thought-provoking and important, and clearly indicating that this can't be, a one-off conversation, which I think is part of what we came into tonight knowing. You don't watch a 12-minute film and expect to know everything and have a clear path ahead, but you can't unsee it, right? And that becomes part of one's memory and understanding. And one of the things I'm hearing from each of you is the importance of advocacy, which is something that, for those of us in the Jewish community, we've got some experience with. And so that becomes important to think about, what are our kids being taught in schools? What is our government doing in our name? What's happening in our neighborhood? Where are those areas where we cannot be silent? But I wanted, since we're sponsored and hosted by the Segal Centre tonight, and Nakuset, I know you were an advisor for that extraordinarily powerful production of Children of God about the residential schools back when we could still be in theaters together. Of all of the urgent things that each of you are doing, maybe just say one last word on what you hope to come from arts and culture. Why invest time and energy here? What do you hope comes out of conversations with the Segal Centre, productions like Children of God, films like the one that we watched tonight?
I'll let Victoria answer it first.
I was gonna say, it's like, I can answer first. I would say, like, for myself, just what got me into like the career that I'm in is because I know that there was one film that had an impact on me that made me want to change the path that I was going on, because I was going down like I could have gone down like this path of like drugs and alcohol like so easily. I was there. I was like at this crossroads in my life when I was like 15, and then this one film I saw totally changed my perspective, and I realized that if one of my works could have an impact on at least one person like that, then that's all I really want. And I realized that's like how art is it's supposed to elicit a reaction, whether it's good or bad, but hopefully good overall.
Can I ask what the film was?
Oh yeah, it's called Another Earth. It's like this like really small indie film. It's honestly, it's a really slow film, but for me, it really impacted me. So
Daniel, do you want to maybe, I was going to give you the last word.
Oh, Daniel, do you want to go?
I mean, yeah, it's going back to what everything you guys said. I mean, it's so important that the word gets out, that we share our stories, and we for our benefit of our kids and the next generations. I mean, they have to know the position of the government. I mean, the change has to come within the government. And unfortunately, our current prime minister is trying to do what he can, but he had such so much energy at the beginning. Oh, we're going to change the housing. We're going to do. But you know what he came upon? He came upon the Indian Act. The Indian Act is a set of laws that can't be changed. So he's caught with his hands tied, and he can't move forward because, well, it's also very political. I mean, within INAC itself, INAC is Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. Within that department, people who are appointed to higher positions were appointed before Trudeau came in, and before Trudeau came in, it was the Conservatives. So you have these people who have conservative beliefs sitting in these positions of power, and here you have Trudeau, a new government, come in, trying to change the minds and the programs, and the people that are actually stopping it are the people that are sitting in those positions with conservative beliefs. And this is an ongoing problem. And I think the majority of the problems too is where they have INAC. Okay, Kitigan Zibi, which is just 2 hours north, that whole area is very racist against First Nations. Like, I've been up there myself, and my mouth dropped, and I was like, I was trying to give a lady a tip, and she didn't want my tip. And my friend who I was with, she says, "Oh no, she doesn't care for your tip." I'm like, "Why? It's money." No, it's because it comes from your hand, right? So if we're talking putting a building in the Quebec side and hiring most of these people who are in this area who are racist, I'm sorry to say, nothing's going to move forward. And as it has been going on for the last decade or so, nothing has moved forward. I mean, you can see the Conservatives that were in power before Trudeau. It got worse under the Conservatives. Now here you have the Liberals in power, and he's trying to move some things forward, but he's caught in the bureaucracy as well as the Indian Act. So that's why nothing moves forward.
I think we have to leave, so I'm just going to do a quick quote, all right? This is Louis Riel, and he said, "My people will sleep for 100 years, but when they awake, it will be the artists who give them their spirit back." And I've always loved that quote because I think of residential school when we were really sort of quiet and, just sort of, listening to the man and not, stepping out of line. But all of a sudden there's this resurgence, and it's the artists. So it's all on your shoulders there, Victoria.
What a beautiful quote to end with. I really want to thank all of you on behalf of everybody here. I want to encourage everyone who is part of this conversation to not let this be a one-off. Watch other of Victoria's films, see the work that Nakuset is doing, hear the stories that Dan and others are sharing, so that the next generation can be a better one, but also that we don't have to wait quite that long. Thank you to the Segal Centre for coming up with this and co-creating it. Thank you for co-hosting with us at Temple. Thank you, all of you, for taking time from your evening to learn even the parts that are painful, the parts that are hopeful. May we come out of this evening with hope and with resolve. Thank you, each and every one of you. Have a good night. Stay warm. Stay safe.